It was 2:47 in the morning. 71-year-old Margaret stood in front of the Sunrise Senior Living Facility, wearing nothing but her nightgown and slippers. A small suitcase rested beside her feet. Around her neck hung a golden locket, the only remaining memento from her late husband, Richard. The car that had brought her there was already vanishing into the darkness of that cold November night. The driver of that car was her own son, David. Margaret watched the taillights fade into the distance. She whispered to herself that he would come back, that this must be some kind of mistake, but the car never turned around. Not that night. Not in the 847 nights that followed. How does a woman who dedicated 47 years of her life to her family end up abandoned on a cold doorstep in the middle of the night? To understand that, we need to go back to where it all began. Margaret was born in 1952 in a small town in rural Ohio. She was the youngest of 4 children in a working-class family. Her father spent 30 years at the local steel mill, leaving for work before dawn and returning after sunset with calloused hands and a weary smile. Her mother was a homemaker who stretched every dollar and taught Margaret that a woman's greatest purpose was to nurture her family. By the time Margaret turned 18, she had absorbed every lesson about sacrifice, duty, and unconditional love. In the summer of 1973, everything changed when Margaret met Richard at a church gathering. He was a tall, reserved man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. He worked as a junior accountant at a small firm in Cleveland. Their connection was immediate and profound. Richard saw in Margaret a warmth and devotion that he had never encountered before. Margaret saw in Richard a steady, reliable man who would be a wonderful father someday. By the following spring, they stood at the altar and exchanged vows that Margaret believed would last forever. Their early years together were modest, but filled with contentment. They rented a small apartment on the east side of Cleveland, where the radiator clanked through cold winters and the windows let in drafts. Margaret took a job as a secretary at an insurance company, while Richard slowly advanced at his firm. They saved every spare penny, depositing coins into a jar they kept on top of the refrigerator. That jar represented their shared dream of owning a home and raising children. That dream began to materialize in 1976, when their first son, David, entered the world. Margaret held him in her arms at Cleveland General Hospital and felt a love so overwhelming that it brought tears to her eyes. She made a silent promise to that tiny, wrinkled infant that she would give him everything, that she would never let him feel unloved or unwanted. She quit her job the following week to become a full-time mother. The next several years were a blur of sleepless nights, first steps, and scraped knees. Margaret poured every ounce of her being into motherhood. She woke before dawn to prepare breakfast and pack lunches. She volunteered at school events, drove carpool, and helped with homework until late into the evening. She learned to sew so she could mend torn clothes instead of buying new ones. She clipped coupons from the Sunday paper and planned meals around whatever was on sale. 2 years after David's birth, their daughter Susan arrived, followed by their youngest son, Thomas, in 1981. The small apartment could no longer contain their growing family, so Richard took out a mortgage on a modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. It was nothing fancy, just a simple brick structure with a small yard, but to Margaret, it was a palace. She spent months transforming it into a home, painting the walls herself, planting roses in the front yard, and hanging family photographs in every room. But life tested them repeatedly. The recession of the early 1980s hit Richard's firm hard. There were months when they had to choose between paying the electricity bill and buying groceries. Margaret never let the children know how dire things had become. She served smaller portions and called them diets. She turned off the heat at night and piled extra blankets on the beds, telling the kids it was an adventure. She went without new clothes for years, so her children could have what they needed. Through it all, Margaret never complained. She told herself that sacrifice was simply what mothers did. She believed that every hardship was an investment in her children's future. One day they would grow up and succeed, and all of this struggle would be worth it. One day they would understand everything she had done for them, and they did grow up. David graduated summa cum laude from law school and landed a prestigious position at a firm in Manhattan. Susan earned her nursing degree and married a successful cardiologist in San Diego. Thomas showed an entrepreneurial spirit from a young age and eventually built a thriving logistics company in Chicago. Margaret watched each of them flourish with immense pride. Her sacrifices had paid off. Her children were living the American dream, but somewhere along the way, something fundamental shifted. It happened so gradually that Margaret almost missed it. The weekly phone calls became bi-weekly, then monthly, then sporadic. The annual holiday gatherings became abbreviated visits filled with distracted glances at smartphones and early departures. Birthday cards arrived late, or not at all. Margaret would call and hear the exhaustion in her children's voices, the impatience barely concealed beneath polite words. David would tell her that work was overwhelming, that he was up for partner and couldn't afford distractions. Susan would explain that the kids had soccer practice and ballet recitals, and there simply weren't enough hours in the day. Thomas rarely answered at all, and when he did, the conversations lasted less than 5 minutes before he invented an excuse to hang up. Margaret made excuses for them. They were busy building their lives, just as she had once been busy building hers. They would come around eventually. When things settled down, when the promotions came through, when the children were older, they would have more time. She repeated these reassurances like a mantra, trying to drown out the growing silence. Richard noticed the change too. In his later years, he became increasingly contemplative, spending hours on the front porch staring at the roses Margaret had planted decades earlier. Sometimes Margaret would find him in the living room, holding old photo albums, his weathered fingers tracing the faces of their children when they were young. He never spoke about it directly, but Margaret could see the sadness in his eyes. Their children had moved on, and somehow they had been left behind. In the fall of 2019, the doctor delivered news that shattered Margaret's world. Richard had stage 4 lung cancer. The tumors had already spread to his lymph nodes and liver. Treatment might buy him a few months, but the outcome was inevitable. Margaret sat in that sterile examination room and felt the ground dissolve beneath her feet. She called all 3 children that evening. David listened quietly and said he would try to visit when his schedule allowed. Susan expressed sympathy and promised to send a care package. Thomas didn't answer, and when Margaret left a voicemail explaining the situation, he responded with a brief text message saying he was sorry to hear the news. None of them came. Margaret cared for Richard alone through the brutal winter of 2019. She learned to administer his medications, to change his oxygen tank, to bathe him when he became too weak to stand. She held him through the long nights when the pain became unbearable and the morphine wasn't enough. She told him stories about their courtship, about their wedding day, about the summer they brought David home from the hospital. She tried to fill his final days with the same love she had given him for 47 years. Richard passed away 3 days before Christmas. Margaret was holding his hand when his breathing slowed and finally stopped. She sat with him for nearly an hour before calling the funeral home, not ready to let go, not ready to face a world without him. She didn't cry. Something inside her had gone numb, a protective barrier against a grief too immense to process. The funeral was a small, somber affair. David flew in from New York but left the following morning, citing an important case that couldn't wait. Susan sent an elaborate flower arrangement but couldn't attend due to a conflict she never fully explained. Thomas arrived late, spent most of the service responding to emails on his phone, and departed immediately after the burial without saying goodbye. Margaret stood alone at the graveside long after everyone else had left. She watched the cemetery workers lower Richard's casket into the frozen earth and wondered how 47 years of marriage could end in such solitude. The roses she placed on his grave were already wilting in the December cold. In the months following Richard's death, Margaret waited for her children to rally around her. She expected phone calls checking on her well-being, perhaps visits to help her adjust to life alone. She imagined them taking turns spending weekends with her, the way she had seen other families care for their widowed parents. None of it happened. The house became unbearably quiet. Margaret started leaving the television on all day just to hear human voices. She cooked elaborate meals for one, old family recipes that filled the kitchen with familiar aromas, then threw most of the food away because she couldn't bear to eat alone. She called her children frequently, sometimes multiple times a week, desperate for connection. The calls were always brief, always interrupted by something more pressing on their end. 6 months after Richard's passing, Margaret was reaching for a jar on the top shelf of her kitchen cabinet when she lost her balance and fell. Her head struck the corner of the counter, and she landed hard on the tile floor. Pain exploded through her wrist and skull. She lay there for nearly 2 hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, before she managed to crawl to the phone. She called David first. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. She called Susan next and reached an automated message. Finally, she called Thomas. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding annoyed at the interruption. When Margaret explained that she had fallen and needed help, Thomas sighed audibly and said he would call someone. He hung up without asking if she was okay. A neighbor eventually called an ambulance. Margaret spent 3 days in the hospital with a mild concussion and a fractured wrist. David sent a text message expressing hope that she would recover quickly. Susan ordered flowers delivered to her hospital room. Thomas never called. It was during this hospital stay that a social worker first suggested assisted living. The woman was kind but direct. She explained that Margaret's fall could have been fatal, that living alone at her age carried significant risks. There were excellent facilities in the area, places where she would have companionship and round-the-clock care. Margaret dismissed the idea immediately. She had her home, the home she and Richard had built together. She had her children, who would surely step up now that they understood how vulnerable she had become. She didn't need strangers taking care of her. But her children didn't step up. The calls remained infrequent, the visits non-existent. Margaret recovered from her fall and returned to the empty house, more cautious now, more afraid. She started sleeping with the lights on because the darkness felt suffocating. She stopped cooking because standing at the stove made her dizzy. She stopped going out because she was terrified of falling again, with no one around to help. The loneliness became a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She would sit by the window for hours, watching cars pass by, hoping one of them would turn into her driveway. None ever did. In the spring of 2021, David made an unexpected visit. Margaret was overjoyed when she saw his rental car pull up to the house. She had spent the previous day cleaning and cooking, preparing his old room, imagining long conversations over dinner. But David hadn't come for a visit. He had come with documents. He sat her down at the kitchen table and explained the situation in the same tone he probably used with difficult clients. The house was too big for her. She couldn't maintain it alone. After her fall, it was clear she needed supervision. He had researched facilities in the area and found one that seemed appropriate. Sunrise Senior Living had good reviews and a solid reputation. Margaret felt her heart crumbling as David spoke. She tried to explain that the house was more than just a building, that it contained 47 years of memories, that Richard's presence still lingered in every room. David listened with thinning patience and then repeated his arguments more firmly. The house would be sold to pay for her care. It was the practical solution, the responsible choice. He slid the papers across the table and handed her a pen. Margaret stared at the documents through blurring vision. She wanted to refuse, to fight, to demand that her children care for her the way she had cared for them. But something inside her had broken. She was too tired to argue, too beaten down to resist. She signed the papers with a trembling hand. The move happened 3 months later on an overcast Tuesday. Margaret watched strangers carry her furniture out of the house she had called home for nearly 50 years. Most of it was sold or donated. She was allowed to bring only what would fit in her new room at Sunrise Senior Living, some clothes, a few photographs, her Bible, and the golden locket Richard had given her on their 25th anniversary. David drove her to the facility and helped carry her boxes inside. The room was small and impersonal, with white walls, a narrow bed, and a window overlooking the parking lot. It smelled of industrial cleaner and artificial air freshener. David set down the last box, checked his watch, and announced that he needed to catch a flight. He promised to call soon and walked out the door before Margaret could respond. He didn't call the next day, or the day after, or any day that week. Margaret tried to adjust to her new reality. She attended the facility's activities, playing bingo with strangers and watching movies she had no interest in. She smiled politely at the staff and made small talk with other residents. She called her children every Sunday, though they rarely answered. When they did, the conversations were hollow exchanges of pleasantries that left Margaret feeling emptier than before. She asked about their lives, their jobs, their children, absorbing every detail hungrily. But when she tried to share her own experiences, she could hear their attention drifting, their eagerness to end the call. Months passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret's health deteriorated, not from any specific illness, but from the cumulative weight of loneliness and despair. She lost her appetite and began skipping meals. She stopped attending activities because the effort of pretending to be okay had become too exhausting. She spent most of her days sitting by the window, watching the parking lot, waiting for a familiar face that never appeared. On her 71st birthday, Margaret woke with a fragile hope that this day would be different. She had reminded all three children the previous week, mentioning the date casually, afraid to seem desperate. Surely they would call. Surely they would remember the woman who had celebrated every one of their birthdays with homemade cakes and carefully chosen gifts. The morning passed in silence. By noon, Margaret had checked her phone a dozen times, convincing herself that the ringer must be broken. By evening, she had stopped checking. The phone sat on her nightstand, dark and silent, a monument to her abandonment. That night, a nurse named Patricia knocked on her door carrying a small chocolate cake with a single candle. She had noticed that Margaret had no visitors, no calls, and she had bought the cake with her own money. She sang happy birthday softly and encouraged Margaret to make a wish. Margaret closed her eyes and wished for her children to remember her. Not for visits or gifts or apologies, but simply to be remembered, to know that she existed in their thoughts, that her 47 years of devotion had left some mark on their hearts. The candle flickered and went out. The wish dissolved into the stale air of the nursing home. 2 weeks later, David called with news that would seal Margaret's fate. The cost of Sunrise Senior Living was higher than anticipated. The money from the house sale was nearly depleted. They needed to move her to a more affordable facility, a state-run nursing home on the outskirts of the city. Margaret listened in numb silence as her son explained the financial calculations. She wanted to ask why her successful children couldn't contribute to her care. David alone earned more in a month than she and Richard had earned in a year. But she didn't ask. She had lost the will to fight for herself. The transfer was scheduled for the end of the month, but complications arose. The state facility had a lengthy waiting list. There might be no available bed for several months. The administrator of Sunrise Senior Living contacted David to discuss alternatives. The response he provided would haunt Margaret for the rest of her days. 3 nights before the scheduled transfer, Margaret was awakened at 2:30 in the morning by a nurse shaking her shoulder. Her son had arrived and wanted to see her immediately. Margaret was confused and disoriented as she was helped into her nightgown and slippers. A small suitcase was packed with her belongings. Before she fully understood what was happening, she was being guided through the dark hallways toward the parking lot. David was waiting by his car, engine running. He didn't look at her as he loaded her suitcase into the trunk. He didn't answer her questions about where they were going. He simply opened the passenger door and waited for her to get in. They drove through the empty streets for nearly an hour. Margaret watched the city lights give way to suburban darkness. She asked repeatedly where David was taking her, but he remained silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the road. A terrible understanding began to dawn in Margaret's mind. The car finally stopped in front of a dark, unfamiliar building. The sign above the entrance was faded and difficult to read. Haven of Rest. Margaret had never heard of it. David got out of the car, retrieved her suitcase from the trunk, and set it on the cold pavement. He pressed the buzzer beside the door and turned back to his mother. For a moment, their eyes met. Margaret searched her son's face for some trace of the boy she had raised, the child she had rocked to sleep, the teenager whose wounds she had bandaged, the young man whose law school graduation had filled her with such pride. She found nothing. His expression was blank, his eyes empty. He got back in the car without a word. The engine revved. The taillights disappeared into the night. Margaret stood alone in the darkness, 71 years old, wearing nothing but her nightgown and slippers, abandoned by the child she had given everything to raise. A night attendant eventually answered the buzzer and helped Margaret inside. Haven of Rest was a state-run facility for elderly patients with nowhere else to go. The hallways were dimly lit and smelled of decay. The staff were overwhelmed and barely had time to process her paperwork before showing her to a cramped room she would share with another resident. Margaret lay awake that first night, staring at the water-stained ceiling, trying to understand how her life had led to this moment. She had done everything right. She had sacrificed, devoted herself, loved unconditionally. And this was her reward: a cold room in a forgotten facility, abandoned by the children she had raised. The days at Haven of Rest blurred together into a gray monotony. Margaret stopped trying to contact her children. The few letters she managed to write were never answered. She stopped hoping for visits, stopped watching the parking lot, stopped believing that things might change. She began talking to Richard in her mind, holding imaginary conversations with the man she had loved for 47 years. She told him about her days, about the terrible food, about the ache in her bones that never quite went away. She asked him why their children had turned out this way, what they had done wrong. Richard never answered, but the conversations brought Margaret a strange comfort. The golden locket never left her neck. Inside were 2 photographs. Richard on their wedding day, young and handsome in his rented tuxedo, and a family portrait from 1985, when David was 9, Susan was 7, and Thomas was 4. They were all smiling in that photograph, frozen in a moment when love seemed infinite and the future seemed bright. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 8 months after David had left her at Haven of Rest, Margaret didn't wake up. A nurse found her still in bed, her hands folded across her chest, her face peaceful for the first time in years. The golden locket rested over her heart. The facility's attempts to reach her children were met with indifference. David didn't return the calls. Susan said she was too busy to make arrangements. Thomas asked if the facility could handle the burial. In the end, Margaret was laid to rest in a small cemetery on the outskirts of the city. There was no service, no mourners, no flowers. Just a simple headstone with her name and 2 dates. The word beloved was engraved beneath her name. It had been chosen by a cemetery worker who had never met her, who knew nothing of her story, who simply selected the most common inscription for a woman of her age. But the word felt like a lie, or perhaps, more accurately, it felt like a broken promise. Margaret had been beloved once, by Richard, by her children when they were young enough to need her. But somewhere along the way, that love had evaporated, replaced by inconvenience and obligation and, finally, abandonment. Her story is not unique. Across the country, in nursing homes and assisted living facilities, thousands of elderly parents wait by windows, hoping for visits that never come. They clutch photographs of children who have forgotten them, replay memories of family dinners and birthday parties and ordinary moments that once seemed unremarkable, but now feel like treasures from another lifetime. They wonder where they went wrong. They question whether they loved too much or not enough. They search for explanations that might make sense of their abandonment. Most never find answers. Margaret's golden locket was buried with her. No one knew what the photographs inside meant, what story they told, what 47 years of love and sacrifice they represented. No one knew about the sleepless nights, the homemade meals, the scraped knees kissed and bandaged, the college tuitions paid, the dreams deferred so that others might flourish. No one knew. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all. Not the abandonment itself, but the erasure that follows. The way a lifetime of devotion can be reduced to a forgotten grave in an unmarked corner of a city cemetery. But you know now. You have heard Margaret's story. And in hearing it, you carry a piece of her forward. Perhaps you have parents who are aging, who live alone, who wait for your calls with hope and dread. Perhaps you have been too busy, too distracted, too caught up in your own life to remember that the people who raised you are still there, still waiting, still loving you even when you forget to love them back. Time is not infinite. The opportunities to visit, to call, to say the words that matter, they diminish with each passing day. And one day, without warning, they will be gone entirely. The phone will ring in an empty room, the grave will be dug and filled, and you will be left with questions that have no answers and regrets that have no remedy. Margaret's story is over, but yours is still being written. What will you do with the time you have left?